Welcome to Season 1, Episode 6. It's called Babylon. When people talk about their top 10 episodes of Mad Men, this episode often gets a mention. I think you have to have seen the whole show to really appreciate the seeds they're planting. You can't just watch this episode as a standalone event and feel satisfied, but as part of the whole experience, this is a keystone episode.
I think this episode really epitomizes what the show is about. We have characters who have desires and needs. To various degrees, they are either getting or not getting those needs satisfied. And that yearning and that want they feel is what lingers in their minds and the minds of the viewer as we watch their lives.
So the episode opens on Mother's Day morning. We can see there's breakfast being made with a yellow tulip. Here's Don making an effort at home. He's finally taking time with his presentation skills in this realm to the point of adding the comics page along with his breakfast that he's making. And the whole effort is shattered when he trips on the stairs.
I'm not a big fan of dream sequences, generally speaking, across various
I was just
series.
going to say that too.
As Dawn changes back into young Dick Whitman, with a similar sort of fall on stairs, and then remembers the birth of Adam and getting introduced to him, I was wondering what the point of the scene was. It seems like kind of an unusual time or place to have a flashback like that. And I was struggling as a viewer to understand what's going on here in Don's mind. Is it just that he has lingering thoughts about Adam and the life he left behind?
Oh, I got you. So I agree. We're just going to have to accept that flashbacks are going to be a device we see with Don's past. In the last episode, Adam came back into Don's life. So we can see here with this flashback that visit is still on his mind, but also the fact that it's Mother's Day. Let's also talk really quickly about young Dick Whitman here. He's played by Brandon Killam, who also played Little Brian in Dexter and young Michael in Arrested Development. So he's got a track record of playing the young versions of characters. Bryn Horrocks plays Abigail Whitman and Morgan Rustler is Uncle Mac. This line where young Dick says he's not sure he wants to go into the room because there was lots of screaming, and Uncle Mac says, always is. So that hints that Uncle Mac has seen a lot of babies born while Dick hasn't. So this is a core memory. And at the time, Dick says of Adam, he ain't my brother. And in the last episode, as an adult, he insisted, she's not my mother. And of course, the woman raising him was married to his father. She's Adam's biological mother, but not Dawn's. And you can see she loves this baby so much. And Dawn was not treated with that same affection growing up. And he keeps up with that distinction throughout his adulthood. So this is a loud call out, I think, to his own experience with a mother figure on Mother's Day.
That makes sense to me.
Adam was named after the first man, his mother says, but as we see later, Dick is named in revenge and in suffering, so he had a rough start to this world. I can't help feeling sorry for Betty that I feel like she's ignored so often, and even here when he makes an effort and he's trying to do something nice for her, and still it gets spoiled again. Dawn's suffering is intruding on their lives all the time.
Maybe, but we don't dwell there with the episode. It quickly moves into the next scene, which is the end of the day, as each parent carries a child upstairs, puts them to bed, and then they're in the bedroom together talking and seeming to really enjoy each other's company and really having that loving connection and relationship that perhaps we've seen in prior episodes, a lot of evidence of the flaws and problems of the relationship. Now it seems we're getting a peek at one of the good moments.
I love the transition to their picture-perfect family coming home, and we don't know where they were. There are no words. Maybe a fair, a carnival. We've got sleepy kids and a red balloon and a stuffed giraffe. And it's this simple demonstration that every once in a while their actions do match their image of this perfect family that does things together. Although, we get the sense that doesn't actually happen very often. So I kind of feel happy for them that they actually got to have this happy family day, and it's been a good day for everybody, which you're kind of relieved for them that they got to have that.
And if you look at the content of the dialogue they have together, it's very much Betty focused. So again, we're not hearing anything about Dawn. There's no reminiscing or him speaking about himself at all. It's really all about Betty and her perspective on things, how things are going with her shrink, talking about the vacation house, about Betty's mother and the rest. So we're getting a lot of Betty's perspective about herself, which is a bit ironic given this situation. They're in bed at the end of a long day. When we've been privy to several of Betty's sessions with the psychiatrist, she's talking about everything except herself.
In the DVD commentary, they mentioned that this scene was January Jones' audition scene for the role of Betty Draper because in the first episode, she had very few lines. You can see this monologue coming up here being a key part of who Betty Draper is. Before they start to have their conversation, Dawn is reading a book called The Best of Everything, and that features an innocent female character who works her way up in a corporate chain in a publishing house. That's kind of a fun nod to this episode of Mad Men, as we'll see in just a little bit. We also know that Joan Crawford was in that film as well. So, of course, they're talking about being old and losing your beauty. And Betty says that's just a terrible fate to imagine. He asks if she had a nice Mother's Day, and she answers that it was lovely. And we know she's been dealing with the loss of her mother. So she talks about how her mother was still very handsome right up until her death. She hopes that she will be too. But as they've been talking about her, Don wants to shut that down. No melancholy. So if we look back and we think about how he shoves his complicated feelings for his family in a box, it seems like he wants to demand that of her too.
And he reinforces that desire, I think, by getting physically amorous and starting to initiate romance with Betty. Betty expresses her attraction to Don, asks him to turn off the light, verbally says how much she longs for him and thinks about him and wants to be with him. So it does feel like a very idyllic, perfect ending to a nice day for the couple.
Don has this line where he says mourning is just extended self-pity. So you can see he doesn't have any time for indulging of feelings conversations. So he brings it around to the mourning rituals in New Guinea. And Betty says, did you know Michelangelo was painting the Sistine ceiling when those people were living in caves? He says, no, I didn't. And he seems to show an interest in her for bringing this factoid up, or maybe he's already attracted to her anyway. And this is our truth call out for this episode because he said, I didn't know that. And she says, well, that's true. Betty reflecting superiority over other people and their ways of doing things, whether it's Helen Bishop's unkempt living room or cave dwellers, she's always happy to think that she's more civilized than the people down the road.
As I watched this scene, I felt a little trepidation, worried that someone was going to say something that would derail it or take it into a dark place. So I found myself throughout the scene sort of on the edge of my seat, wondering if somebody was going to say something to ruin the mood or put someone off. It doesn't happen, but it does feel that they dance and flirt a little bit with that edge.
That's such a good point. And it's so true. We just don't get very much happiness between them for an extended period of time. And whenever they start having a discussion, it's dangerous. So there is that moment where they're having this flirty banter with their biology studies. And she says, I got an A. And he said, I flunked. And she said, it's because you got caught cheating. She's giggling and joking. She doesn't know that she's calling him out. So there's this pause. I had that same feeling like, oh, I don't know how this is going to go. Her monologue about needing him is so sentimental and personal and expressing her need for intimacy, which she hasn't been able to name or claim before. So she talks about going through the motions of the rest of her life. And he just simply says, you have me. And she's almost crying. And he assures her, you do. But you know how little of him she actually gets. So it still seems sad.
It's also an interesting juxtaposition with later in the episode when there's a scene where she expresses interest in him and he puts her off. And I think that's in direct contrast to this scene.
Yes, for sure.
We now cut back to the office where we're in a business meeting between Sterling Cooper, Olympic Cruise Lines, and the Israeli Ministry of Tourism. Israel's interested in an ad campaign to promote tourism to Israel, and Sterling Cooper, because of their prior work, is being considered.
Actors here include Danny Jacobs, who's done a ton of voice work, most notably King Julian in Penguins of Madagascar, and also Irene Rosine. She's been in everything from Glee to Star Trek and The Rich and the Ruthless. And when she says they saw Sterling Cooper's awards and were impressed, and they thought they'd try a traditional option, Don bristles. And I appreciate this moment. As a creative, he wants to imagine that he's new and unique from everybody else.
But that said, the reason they're in this meeting right now is because of the success with the prior campaign for Rio as a glamorous, exotic tourist destination. And the conversation quickly goes into what are the characteristics or aspects of Israel that might appeal to tourists. The team is struggling a little bit coming up with things to make their hook on. They've got the book Exodus, which has come out, that's being made into a movie starring Paul Newman, a major, A-list star. We've got the American love affair with Israel, they cite, of this plucky underdog scraping out success and life in the desert. Dawn asks about what constitutes the ideal tourist, and the response is someone who makes however much money Dawn makes. So clearly there's an affluent clientele there.
And Roger says, they always say that. You wonder how many meetings have gone like that where Dawn is their ideal client. In Signs of the Times here, this book, Exodus, was published in 1958, and it became the biggest U.S. bestseller since Gone with the Wind, which was published in 1936. Moving on, we see Margaret and Mona are waiting for Roger. This is the introduction of Elizabeth Rice as Margaret Sterling. Her recognizable projects include Odd Girl Out and From Within. As Dawn and Joan walk up together, Mona, Roger's wife, says, "Oh, don't you make a handsome couple?" And yet everything Margaret says and does seems calculated to irritate Roger. He seems to love her like a toy. He's nostalgic for when she used to love to come to the office, and he likes her ponytail the way it is. But he also doesn't have a lot of time to hear about her life or spend time with her.
It really does seem to be that cliched father who's now has a distance between himself and his teenage daughter for exactly those reasons. Margaret does not look happy to be there. She looks bored, irritated. We don't really see any signs of affection or connection between her and Roger at all.
So Mona and Margaret are in the city to get Margaret a haircut, and it's odd that they've come into the city without an appointment, but Joan references Brigitte Bardot as a haircut inspiration and says she'll make an appointment. Simone de Beauvoir wrote an essay about Brigitte Bardot called The Lolita Syndrome and called her the most liberated woman of France. And this is an interesting reference for Joan, who, like Bardot, might be also called a sex kitten and recognized for her professional success. So again, the writers just keep throwing in these layered references to different people, as well as helping us live in the world of 1960.
And any childishness that we perceive in Margaret is allayed when Dawn shows up and Margaret is staring at him with great interest. And this further emphasizes the handsome beauty of Dawn and that Margaret is a young woman who's interested in him.
It's clearly so inappropriate and so awkward. You do get the sense that mostly she's doing it just to show her father how separate she is from him and how she's not interested in connecting to him. She has her own life.
And it does seem that Roger notices Margaret's looks at Dawn. He doesn't address them directly, but he also doesn't hesitate to usher everyone forward and move things forward so that we're not stuck with this lingering awkwardness in the scene.
And we move from this family scene in the office to a hotel room where we suddenly realize that Joan and Roger have been together for a year. So she just made nice with his wife in the office and made a hair appointment for his daughter. Their worlds aren't very separate, the way that Midge is from Betty, for example. And now we know that 5 of the big 6 characters have secret relationships. So Dawn and Roger are both married and unfaithful, and Pete was engaged the night that he and Peggy had their one-night stand. And now we know that Joan has been involved with Roger for a while. So Betty is the only lead who isn't having a secret affair, and she's miserable. Not that secret affairs are a life hack, but it's not going well for fidelity for 5 of the 6 of the leads.
I love the cut from the domestic angst scene in the office with Roger's family to Roger in bed talking to somebody who we can't see as the camera pans over is revealed to be Joan. As the viewer, this is our first indication of their affair. And then the reference to how long it's been going on, you realize this isn't some brief impulse or flirtation, that this is a long-term affair in the true sense of the word.
And he says, "This has been the best year of my life. Do you have any idea how unhappy I was before I met you? I was thinking of leaving my wife." So now that he's having an affair, he's going to stay with his wife, which I don't understand that.
Well, the part that struck me in this scene is when Joan takes Roger's comments and he's talking all about affection and they should do more and go further with this relationship. And really the way she speaks of it is all in terms of limitation. It serves a purpose and she enjoys it as well, but it doesn't have any long-term future, and that at some point it's going to need to end and they're both going to move on to other things. It really, from the perspective of someone who's seen the entire series, to me foreshadows exactly what's going to happen here. And there's another scene later in the episode with another character who foreshadows something very similarly. So I found it very interesting that even as Roger's focused on all the pluses and advantages and good aspects from his perspective, Joan is in effect setting limits, pouring a bit of cold water on things.
He wants to indulge in the romantic possibilities, and she doesn't let herself go there. She knows how this ends. She's making her carefree life sound perfect the way it is, and she throws in a few things, I think, to make him a bit jealous, but she's very honest about how eventually she'll find something more permanent, she says, and he will move on to a new model. That brings us to our Mad Men from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo double dip question for this episode for our listeners. Do you think that Roger and Joan would have made a good long-term couple? I'm really interested to hear what you think about this. If they are really good for each other and you think that this would have been a lasting thing, is this a relationship that's built to last? Please share your insights with us at www.madmenctozoo.com, and we'll talk about this and other double dip questions more on a future episode.
And at the risk of showing my hand in terms of an answer to that question, I found it interesting that Roger's vision of this relationship is very much what Roger wants, what would serve Roger's needs the best, Roger's ideal. It's a very selfish perspective. And as Joan responds back to that, she says it would be half as fun if she were devoted to Roger. Makes a very strong allusion to her own life and her own needs. And as she talks about the future, she says that eventually she'll find a permanent situation, thereby directly implying that this current situation is not permanent and could never be permanent, and as well that Roger will find a new model.
Speaking of Roger's selfishness, he opens by talking to Joan about his problems with his daughter. Joan isn't talking about her problems in any other area of her life, but Roger brings that in. He talks about how they don't know what to do with her, that she doesn't want to go to college or work, and she's not interested in charity. And two of the boys she dated didn't work out. And he's spelling out these socially acceptable options for his daughter while he tries to convince his longtime mistress to stay a little bit longer. And he does have this really funny line about they have some food and he says, "Here, stay for the oysters, Rockefeller, beef Wellington, Napoleon. If we leave this food alone, it'll take over Europe." He is bringing his Roger charm, but he definitely isn't offering anything serious or meaningful to her as a partner.
I think as a viewer, I could really sympathize with Joan's perspective here. She's going to enjoy the benefits and amusement of what she's got, but she also has ambitions and her eyes on something bigger and better in the future, something permanent.
In the next scene, we've got a meeting in the office with Sal, Paul, and Don, and they're talking about how to market Israeli tourism. What did you think about this?
My take as a reader was it felt like it was the Gentiles trying to figure out Israel and struggling a bit with it, not really having a good sense of it. They have a cursory, superficial, surface level understanding of things, and they're spitballing ideas and throwing them out there. Pete talks about exploiting danger, travel as an adventure. Sal talks about the religious undertones of Moses parting the Red Sea, the Promised Land. Pete morphs into politics and the collectivism of the kibbutzes. Paul talks about their story as being a semi-communist state and arming women and the success of their struggle to create a country in the desert. It just seems they're all over the place, and it's just clear they don't really have any original ideas or insights into the topic of Israeli tourism.
Yes, so unlike their other products, they're not sure where to go, just floundering all over the place. And Don uses it as an excuse to call Rachel Menken.
The one line I found amusing in the scene was when Sal points out that the people are highly attractive and holds up a picture of a young Israeli woman. Just that raw pitch to sex appeal, beautiful people, to me rang very true in terms of that ad men mentality about the world and what might attract tourists to go to a place.
That's what they know how to promote, but the whole rest of the story, they don't understand. So in bed that night, Don is reading Exodus, and Betty asks him about it. And then she tells this story about how the first boy she ever kissed was Jewish, and she does get Don's full attention. And the story is basically about how her friends were rude after, and the boy was good looking, but he only picked her because she wasn't part of the synagogue. She makes a comment about how all the other girls were blondes by the next summer, and it betrays how much she loved being someone that people noticed and imitated. And it also reveals that she's similarly part of that culture Don's office belongs to, where they see Jewish people as other. It's separate. It's different.
I think the casual anti-Semitism and otherness really permeates the show. And I like the writing a lot because it feels very true to me. Some of the over-the-top blatant racism and prejudice can sometimes hit really hard and feel very artificial and forced to drive a plot along or show us who the bad characters are. The casual anti-Semitism in Mad Men, I think, is very well written. and really speaks to the reality of these prejudices and bigotry in general, where it can go from being almost imperceptible to being quite prominent. Again, from myself, just a tip of the hat to the writers, because I think they really handle this well and thoughtfully in a way that we can see it around us in our world today as echoes of a diminished version of what once existed, or maybe not so diminished, depending on your perspective.
It's so blatantly ugly, even as the characters are self-absorbed with their own concerns, separate from it. Yes, it's very well crafted because Betty isn't concerned about being rude or unfair to an entire group of people. We can see that she is part of the problem.
I do think we get a bit of an insight into Dawn's character here. He doesn't seem to care that her first kiss was with a Jewish boy, and he doesn't seem to manifest any of the anti-Semitic feelings. He's very mission focused. He's got an ad campaign he wants to win, and he's not hung up about politics or prejudice, at least in the way that it's a conscious thought or an agenda on his part. The other part I'd like to mention in this scene is at the end of it, when Betty expresses her longing for him and wants to start to get physical. Dawn says that he's hot and he needs to finish reading this book, which is somewhat heartbreaking after the prior scene where they were in bed and she expresses just how much she loves and wants him, and they consummate the evening together. In this case, we're back to what we've come to expect between Dawn and Betty, where what Betty wants isn't what Betty's going to get.
It's hot and I have to read this book about the desert. Come on, man. And she goes, oh, of course. And he just goes back to reading. I wondered, is he preoccupied with the work question, or is it about seeing Rachel Mencken because they have this appointment?
Yeah, that's a good question. It isn't clear. Perhaps there's both elements going on there. In any event, it's a disappointment for Betty. She handles it well. She doesn't seem to dwell on it, but it does feel like just another knock.
In their previous scene together, she was open and intimate and expressed her need to be with him and how much she looked forward to it. So for him to casually dismiss her seems like an extra shot. It definitely shows her that expressing her needs is not necessarily the best way to get what she wants. He's so ready to reject her. The next scene takes us into the office. We get to meet Fred Rumsen. This is Joel Murray. He's the youngest of 9 brothers, including Bill Murray. His recognizable projects include Shameless, Dharma and Greg, Love and War, Still Standing, and 2.5 Men. And in an office where everyone drinks excessively, the guys are still making fun of Freddie for putting alcohol in his orange juice. He says, a day without orange juice is a hell of a long day. So we understand this is his daily habit.
It's pretty clear from this introduction that Freddie is a functioning alcoholic. There were probably no shortage of those on Madison Avenue back at that time. They're talking about the Belle Jolie account and the challenges that the brand is having. They have lots of different colors, but terrible sales. Kenny offers a bit of biology, talking about the lipstick representing the flush of a woman's face.
And Fred's response here says, if you're going to quote the research, don't start with, did you know, when Ken tries to act like an expert here. That really establishes Fred Rumsen as having some credibility, some longevity. He's done this work. He's been around for a while. And you can see he has some competence here because he's familiar with the research. He's prepped for this meeting.
He's clearly done the readings himself. Fred is the one who suggests that because they have a lack of ideas here, they should throw it to the chickens, is the term that Fred uses, referencing the women in the office, and that they can turn them loose on the lipstick and gauge their reactions. And perhaps that'll be a way of brainstorming an idea for this campaign.
And this theme with birds is going to be stronger throughout this episode. But he also says, I don't speak moron. Do either of you speak moron? Let's throw it to the chickens. So it's so dismissive. And then we cut to the scene where Joan says, hey, girls, come on. And it's, quote, brainstorming session. But really, the guys are watching with the pretense that they're doing research, but they're leering and judgy through one-way glass. It's like an event. It's like they're staring at them in a zoo. Freddie called them chickens, and they're in this box being watched, all these women trying on lipstick and ostensibly having a good time. Joan presents it that way, but it's definitely not treating women with any kind of respect.
It's really cringe and hard to fathom from a modern perspective that something like this would occur. It's interesting to me that they have no ideas and they concede the point and set up the women to work with the product in the hopes of getting some insights that might be useful to them. But there's no expectation or thought at all that women themselves may have something to say about lipstick of use. They're the subjects of the experiment, and they will behave and react in certain ways that the admin will understand and then interpret to arrive at a campaign. But there's no sense of the women as participating as equals or having valid observations. The low expectations and that glass ceiling that has been installed above these women, they have no way of getting through it. And in fact, the men are looking down through the glass ceiling as they leer at them.
And Paul says, brainstorming, I wouldn't expect more than a few sprinkles. To your point about nobody expecting the women to have anything useful to say they're observing, there's a researcher in the room asking questions. So she asks Allison questions, and she looks at Joan before she answers. And they're not even high stakes questions. They're things like, do you change your lipstick with the seasons? But Joan seems to be giving approval or disapproval before each answer. So the marketer tries to send Joan away, and Joan really loves being in charge, and she's not trying on lipstick herself. So she keeps herself separate from the crowd. It's like she's hosting it, but she's really in the way of anyone saying anything useful or honest for research. So her job is to keep everybody in line.
And she's establishing that hierarchy again, where she's the queen bee and all the admins understand and mind their place, except one who we'll learn more about in a little bit. It's also interesting to me that Joan is the one woman who realizes the men are all behind the glass, plays and performs for them, and does a rather deliberate turn and bends over, presenting her derriere to the mirror. And it's all for the benefit of the men. So she's in many ways a willing participant in this, even as she torments the researcher and guides her admins and teases the men. She's the one person who's in control in this scene, it seems.
There's a bit of a slow motion camera pan with a jazzy musical theme playing under it. And we see all these women applying and blotting lipstick, and Peggy sits among them, but apart. She's not putting on any lipstick. So we see that she also sits apart, but for a different reason from Joan.
Yeah, Peggy is very clearly called out for not being like the others. Peggy's not sitting there staring blankly. She's clearly observing the other women and watching what they're doing, even as she doesn't participate in it herself. And I think it creates interest and intrigue in her character, because you wonder what's going through her head. What is she thinking here?
And Paul notices it. So he's behind the glass, and Sal is being really mean about the women who are putting on lipstick. But Paul notices her. And remember, he hit on her earlier, and he thinks that she's with Dawn. He says, what's up with mouse ears is his question. But nobody really pursues that. It's not that interesting to him or anybody else. Why is she sitting by herself? What is she thinking about? Nobody cares.
The next scene takes us to the restaurant, where it's that classic Mad Men signature shot from behind, Dawn sitting at the table, smoking, drinking, waiting for Rachel to show up. She does show up and has a sly little grin towards Dawn as he gets up and seats her quite like a gentleman.
This scene is so packed with great lines. You could not take it in isolation, and that is really the genius of Mad Men. Everything is so layered and so connected. But this particular scene just packs a really powerful punch, and it's hard to isolate any one moment because everything is so richly layered. This conversation that Dawn and Rachel are having about Israel and being Jewish in America is so inappropriate. There is no way. It is her job to explain this to him, and he's completely rude. So she says that the idea of Israel is important, and he says, well, why don't you live there? It's just she still seems other to him. She says, my life is here, and it feels strange being treated like an expert on being Jewish in America. This feels like maybe a bit of Weiner explaining to the audience about this idea of asking one person to represent a group of people.
It does feel that Rachel is mocking and teasing Dawn a lot in this scene. She challenges him, saying, am I the only Jew you know in New York City? When they talk about the movie with Exodus, and I believe Dawn's the one who says that Paul Newman is playing in it, Rachel says, now I have 2 reasons to see it. Poking and prodding him, I think, about trying to categorize me and create a checklist of things and reasons of how I would think or why I would do something. And it seems that Rachel is just very well aware of the limitations of Dawn's thinking on this subject and enjoying and amusing herself with teasing and taunting him a little.
But it's darker, too. She says, we thrive at doing business with people who hate us. And he says, I don't hate you. And she goes, no, individuals are wonderful. It really represents this pattern that she's clearly faced through her life. And she's throwing that back in his face. Now he has to represent this ignorance that she's lived with. And now he has to stand and represent that.
In some ways, she's reciprocating some of the views and stereotypes that she's accusing him of, because why should Don be especially well informed or knowledgeable about Jewishness or Israel? And to our knowledge, in the show at least, we haven't seen him express much in the ways of any hard beliefs or thoughts about it one way or the other. Yet Rachel is painting him with the same brush that she's painting American society, which might be a reasonable assumption. But as a viewer, I feel it's still an assumption at this point.
And she gets into it here with, my grandfather came from Russia, and now we have a store on Fifth Avenue. I'll visit, but I don't have to live there. It just has to be. It's more of an idea than a place. And then they have this discussion about utopia. Of course, they're not really talking about one thing anymore. She says the difference between utopos, the beautiful place, versus utopos, the place that cannot be. It's not so subtle about their relationship, but there are all these details about will they or won't they. Here's this well-educated woman. She's not afraid to demonstrate it. She pulls her hand away and she keeps it all business. But she also blots a spill on his tie, and they feel very natural together, except for the whole he's married and ostensibly made a commitment to somebody else, and his affair with Midge and his commitment issues in general. But this connection they have between them is very strong.
And she's rebuffed him on prior occasions. So when she does that semi-intimate, public intimate act of cleaning his tie, I think as a viewer, I wonder, okay, is she going to rebuff him again here and put up her hand and say stop? Because it's been clear in the prior interactions that Dawn's the one willing to transgress here and move across. And she's been the one holding this relationship or potential relationship at bay. As we go through this scene, we don't have that moment of tension or no or shutdown that we've had in the prior scenes. But we also don't have a clear, we're going to go forward or proceed at this point moment either.
And when she says, you're usually so put together, that implies a familiarity with him too, that they really don't necessarily have yet. That does seem like she's letting some guard down. And her last line in this scene, I better not see this on my bill, is pitch perfect.
It's a great line. And I think that theme of the good place and the place that cannot be, that's really the juxtaposition we've seen for a bunch of characters in this episode, because it seems to be evidenced and touched upon for Roger and Joan, for Peggy as something more than just an admin assistant, for Dawn and Betty, now for Rachel and Dawn. At every turn, we seem to be bumping into that limit and everyone perched or caught between those two ideals.
Yes, in a lot of ways, this conversation is the crux of most of the conflicts in the show. As good as that scene is, here we get to one of the most iconic situations in Mad Men. I think it's a favorite with a lot of fans. Joan says, okay, girls, playtime's over. We're back at the office. Thanks for your cooperation and your lips. And she's ushering everybody out of their brainstorming session. Peggy hands Freddie the garbage basket, saying, here's your basket of kisses. And he assumes that she heard it somewhere. And when he asks her what she thought, and she said she didn't get the color she liked, she's particular, she doesn't think anyone wants to be one of 100 colors in a box. Freddie's looking at her with interest, and Joan comes along and puts a stop to it. And she says, that's enough complaining. Head back to your desk, Peggy. And then to Fred, she says, I bet you wish you could pour that in a glass and drink it. And all she can see is this male interest in a young woman. She doesn't hear the idea, and she doesn't see the potential the way that he does.
That was my interpretation as well. And I think Joan is really misreading Freddie's interest here, because I don't think it's sexual at all. I think, again, we're getting a clue about what a professional Fred is. Despite his alcoholism, he's a professional in this business, and he's just got some really interesting, useful feedback, both the basket of kisses and how a woman wants to feel about her lipstick. And this has got his antennas up. And Joan, like you mentioned, I think misinterprets it as just an older man interested in the latest young thing in the office. But what I love about the Freddie character is it's not that at all. Peggy's put the hook into Fred with her observations and comments here.
So he takes time to follow up in Dawn's office. So he comes in and he says, hey, your girl, pretty interesting. And Dawn is very surprised that Peggy has anything of interest to say. And here's Fred Rumsen, who pours alcohol into his orange juice every morning. He's the person who listened to Peggy. And he says she really stood out brainstorming-wise. It was like watching a dog play the piano. So he is as sexist as they come. And he still notices that she has something to say.
He's as sexist as they come, but he's a professional. He reads the research. And as we saw in an earlier episode, Don hardly bothers to read the research until he gets stumped or his raw creative genius can't carry him through. Then he'll start to go back and put in the work and effort. It seems that Freddie comes from it from the other direction. And because of that, he's able to notice something that Don has missed. Don puts down Peggy and talks about her earnestness, basically mocking her innocence and lack of experience. Freddie's the one who's able to see that despite those weaknesses or deficiencies at this point in their career, she's bringing other qualities and he's noticed them. And he gives her credit for being the source of them.
And I think as a viewer, since we started work with Peggy on her first day, we're naturally sympathetic to her. And even though it's this tiny little moment of a win, and you're so proud of her, you're like, yeah, Peggy, good job. Way to get noticed for something positive. It feels like such a huge win.
And I think it serves, again, to remind us of just what a mountain someone like Peggy is facing to get up, how many obstacles and blockers and dead ends and obstacles she's going to face. It's not completely blocked. There are paths and there are ways, there are cracks and ways to squeeze up. And it's going to take the input and whatever her future success is, it's going to be the product of a lot of chance, astute comments, thoughtfulness, and just opportunities to say something or to be seen in a world where so often you're going to be ignored or looked over.
And this scene cuts to a conversation between Rachel and her sister Barbara, played by Rebecca Kreskoff. You might recognize her from Hung, Quintuplets, and Elsbeth. She gives us an idea of what Rachel really thinks about Dawn in this conversation. And it's almost about her getting permission from her sister to be with Dawn, although she never tells her sister that Dawn is married. So the sister is asking questions about Dawn, and we don't get to see inside Dawn's head exactly either because of his masks and things that we've talked about before. But I love getting this little window on, would Daddy hate him? Daddy would hate him. Oh, so he's not Jewish. And then I love this little line about, you're 28 years old. You don't want to end up like Aunt Rosie lying about how many engagements you've had. It's like, Uncle Max was not. They have all this history. Again, we don't even know this character, but the writers have done the work of creating this backstory. So this is a very believable relationship, and the shorthand that they have is really on point.
I also enjoyed the foreshadowing moment at the end of the scene when Rachel says, good things come, but there's no future in them. This has been her hang up about Dawn and dabbling with him all along. What is the future here? What is the potential?
It was so cynical, though, compared to before. She stood up to Don when he said that love was invented by ad men. Barbara says, you don't have to be so cynical. It's 1960. We can marry for love. And she says, I'm not sure people do that anymore. This is a call out, too, for a common theme in Mad Men when characters talk about what other people do or what other people don't do and what's expected, basically. It was sad to see Rachel saying, maybe I will say yes to this because the dream of love that I held on to isn't actually possible.
Maybe a less dark interpretation would be she's willing to roll the dice on this, that the attractions and the appeal are such that despite being open-eyed to the potential limitations and the long odds here, that she's willing to roll the dice because there's enough appeal there to justify the gamble. And I like that writing because I think that is a way that a lot of people function in the real world. Nothing is a sure thing. So at some point, you've got to take a calculated risk. And I get the sense that in this conversation with her sister, she's making that calculated risk and sort of thinking through it to arrive at her decision.
And her sister amplifies what's likely as well. She says, there's a baby crying. And she says, believe me, I'd do anything for some romance right now. Her message is sort of seize the day. So as Rachel considers those options, I think that pushes her a little bit more towards something that she does want for herself, even if she doesn't think it's the right thing to do.
We then go to Peggy and Joan speaking in the office. Joan lets Peggy know that Freddie wants Peggy to help on the Belle Jolie copywriting session. Peggy's thrilled, surprised. Joan then tamps down and talks about how Peggy still has her other responsibilities.
The news could not be delivered in a more insulting way. She says, Mr. Rumsen would like you to put your industrious little mind to coming up with copy for Belle Jolie lipstick. And Peggy is shocked. She's like, I don't understand. You will, of course, be covering Mr. Draper's desk. So it's like she has to write on her own time and she doesn't get a raise, but maybe some dinner money. And she says, oh, should I go say thank you? And Joan says, no, they were very specific. She's the go-between. She's keeping the control there. In spite of all that, Peggy cannot help but be pleased. So it's the worst kind of promotion, but she loves it. She doesn't care about the slight. She gets to write.
I like the writing here of Peggy's character. Peggy is pleasantly surprised and shocked that she's been noticed, which shows that back when she made the comments to Freddie, she had no illusions that potentially she was demonstrating what she's bringing to the table. She was just doing what her job was and answered honestly and truthfully. Now she's benefiting from that, and it's a total shock and surprise to her. In these early episodes, when we start to see Peggy emerge as a copywriter, I always wrestled with whether Joan feels any jealousy towards Peggy and making this move. And listening to the DVD commentary and watching the scenes again, I think my conclusion is Joan isn't jealous of Peggy at all. Joan has her own plans and things, but Joan is the queen bee, wants to run the office. And the problem with Peggy, from Joan's perspective, is Peggy does her own thing and doesn't take Joan's advice or doesn't obey Joan. And this is a source of friction. But in terms of what Peggy's path is going to be, I don't perceive that Joan has any personal interest in that path at all.
I agree. I think it's really simplistic of people to accuse Joan of jealousy here. What Peggy seeks is not at all what Joan wants to have. So she's not jealous of that. But I think Peggy is confusing to her because in spite of the fact that she's new and Joan could tell her what to do and she would be okay in Joan's opinion, Peggy doesn't want what Joan is selling, and she's probably not met anybody like that. I think jealousy is such a simplistic, unfortunate explanation for their friction between these two characters.
But I think if you were to ask the men in the office if Joan and Peggy had friction between them, why would it be? I think the sexist men would arrive at that simple answer. It would explain it to them well enough to suit the circumstances they're seeing, even though it's not the case.
Oh, I don't know. I think viewers accuse Joan of jealousy, but I don't think the men in the office, first of all, would think about it at all. And secondly, I don't think it would be conceivable to them that somebody like Joan could be jealous of somebody like Peggy.
I'm not saying they have that question. I was just doing a hypothetical if it were posed to them or if they notice friction between Joan and Peggy.
I don't think they could conceive of a reality where Joan could be jealous of Peggy. And they do see that Joan has power. Of course, it's over the women, so it's less than their power. And Peggy is new, and they don't even think about her at all. So I don't think that they could even have any kind of suggestion of that. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just disappointed that fans seem to think so, because I think their relationship and their characters are more complex and deserving of more attention than that explanation.
We then find ourselves back at Midge's apartment. Don has arrived. It's clear what's on his mind, but his plans go askew when one of Midge's other friends, a beatnik named Roy, knocks at the door, and Don becomes quite frustrated.
Roy Hazlett is played by Ian Bohen. He's known from Yellowstone, Teen Wolf, and Superman and Lois. And Don is so irritated that he and Midge are being interrupted. And he's bumping up against the reality that Midge has another life too. She's not just around whenever he shows up. That was similar to Roger seeing all the men noticing Joan. And he knows that that is true. And Don knows that Midge has other men in her life. And so he knows it is an unreasonable thing to be irritated, but he's still impatient.
I think Midge enjoys this encounter between Roy and Don, because I think it's a bit of a power play on her part, and she enjoys setting them at each other and letting them poke and strut and try and one-up each other for her attention and benefit. The outcome of the scene is that they all decide to go to a beatnik club together. Don is hesitant, but Midge figures out how to lure him there. The competition between Roy and Don continues in the bar, and there's a whole bunch of delicious lines here where Roy talks about mediocrity is born on Broadway. Don replies that maybe it's born there, but it's conceived right here in this beatnik club where there's some random free verse poetry going on. Don flashes his money. Roy obviously can't compete with that. Roy denounces Madison Avenue for perpetuating the lie. and asks how Donnie sleeps at night. Don, of course, cuts back with, "I sleep on a bed of money." Roy denounces creating a religion of mass consumption. Don says that people want to be told what to do. Don has a nice shot at Roy saying he spends more time on his hair than Midge did. Don asks Roy, "If you had a job, what would you do?" It's just a whole bunch of witty fighting between them, and Midge is sitting there in the middle, just enjoying the spectacle and taunting and teasing them if they want to go in the back and finish things up.
It's a wonderful scene full of digs and insults, and both men are jealous and pretending not to be. They're both guilty of what the other is accusing them of being. So Don is old-fashioned and corporate, and Roy is unemployed and not making art, even though he spends all his time talking about what art means. It would be weird if we didn't hear this voice against consumerism and advertising in the 60s. It's interesting how Don won't apologize for being in advertising, even though he carries some of that same distaste for the pencil pushers and account guys that Roy feels for him. Both Don and Roy enjoy this idea that they are special and artistic and they can see things that others can't. And then here's Midge just sitting in the middle calling them on their peacock displays.
And it's a little ironic that as different as Don and Roy are, why are they both engaged in this competition? They're both after the same thing. It's Midge's attentions and the jealousy that Midge is sharing her time with this other man who's so different. It's just a really great scene and easily one of my favorite in Mad Men across all the seasons.
And a quick cut here to another meeting between Joan and Roger in a hotel room where, again, Roger is talking about his problems, but Joan isn't. Just like Midge with Dawn, she's fun and she's flirty and she's not weighing him down with any real concerns and she doesn't want to be in a cage. He has brought her a bird cage, and this is a symbol of, oh, I'd like to get you an apartment and just keep you there and visit you whenever I feel like it. She says, well, I'd be lonely without my roommate. And he says, well, you could get a bird. So this bird in the cage that he gives her is really a very sad gift.
And as the scene breaks up, they go their separate ways. So they're now all dressed up, standing apart on the sidewalk, hailing their cabs to go their separate ways. And I think it gets back to this unattainable place reality of this relationship, this affair. You know, as much as they enjoy their time together, it's limited, it's restricted. And again, as the viewer, we have to wonder, what is the future of this relationship for either of them?
And Midge's friend Ian is performing at the club, and he begins to sing a song called By the Waters of Babylon. Fun fact, David Carbonara, the composer for Mad Men, is the guy standing to the right of the singer. We get this montage as the music plays of different characters from the episode. In this same episode about Belle Jolie lipstick, where Betty confesses her intense desire for her husband and then he puts her off, now she is showing her daughter how to apply lipstick as Sally plays dress up. And you feel like this is maybe a nostalgic mother-daughter moment, but you also really don't want Sally to grow up and have this same unhappy life as Betty, focused on being pretty for men who treat her badly. The scene cuts to Rachel in the department store, smoothing a necktie on display. Then we see Joan and Roger exiting the hotel. They're separate, they're standing apart, and she's carrying a bird in a cage.
Babylon is in ruins. How will everyone survive and thrive from this moment forward? I think that this parallel between all the characters is so striking as they seek what they need or want in life. And there's these obstacles and blockers that prevent them from getting it. The interesting part is how much those blockers represent themselves, their own limitations, rather than obstructions that are imposed by somebody else. It's their choices, their decisions that are imprisoning them or inhibiting them from getting what they want.
Yes, this episode just continues to be a very strong candidate for a favorite episode across the series. It's introducing a first plot line for Joan and for Roger. They're the last two of our big six characters to get notice. It does start telling the story of Don's past and his parents. It's addressing the anti-Semitism in the 60s that continues to be something that America wrestles with in its present. And it launches Peggy's career. She's got these creative ideas, and unlike Pete, she doesn't run around telling people how creative she is or how she's an idea person. Her ideas speak for themselves when somebody takes a minute to listen. This episode also brings a lot of memorable lines. Let us know your favorites by voting on www.madmencdizzy.com. We'd love to hear your favorites.
That's it for this episode of All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. Visit our website, madmenctoz.com, to vote for your favorite Sterling lines and to share your opinions on our double dip questions for each episode.
You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Madmen C to Z, and please listen, like, and subscribe. That's what the podcast's for.
Thanks for listening, everybody.